On 16 December 1773, the evening of the American Revolution, a group of Bostonians climbed aboard 3 British ships carrying tea from China. In a flurry of patriotic fervour, they chucked all the tea overboard, making what has to be one of the most disappointing brews in history. Well, at least they didn't microwave it. So, as we commemorate the 250th birthday of the United States of America, we take a look at this act of tea wastage, which is often cited as one of the pivotal moments that sparked the American Revolution, and ask the question, why? Why did they vandalize a tea shipment? And why was it in Boston? Also, what type of tea did they chuck overboard? And if one was to take a sip out of the Boston harbour on that crisp December morning, what would it have tasted like? Also, we should address that, yes, our treasured colleague recently made a video on the same topic. We were already halfway through this script when that landed. Although, for obvious reasons, we come to this story from the other side. Jokes aside, we should point out that this topic was hotly debated when it happened and is, especially in historical circles, still debated today. Everyone looks at what happened through a certain lens, and as much as we try to be neutral and objective, it is impossible to be fully without any bias. Alright, off we go! Okay, that should be enough disclaimer for the treason. Usually the TLDR given for the Boston Tea Party is that a fresh tax on tea was about to come in, imposed by Westminster, and since the colonies were not consulted, patriots planned a protest. They destroyed all the tea before it could reach the harbour, preventing tax revenue from being collected. And they did so under the now very familiar motto, no taxation without representation. It's a great story, largely helped by the fact that today tea is seen as such a typical British cultural staple. So destroying it as an act of uprising on the eve of your revolution, prime box office. And here's the best part, the story is sort of true, but there's a lot more to it. Let's start at the beginning. In the middle of the 18th century, the ascendant British Empire was facing a conundrum with regards to its North American colonies. Compared to other colonies, for example Spain and Portugal's holdings in South America, North America was relatively poor on natural resources. So where richer colonies had economies built around extracting natural wealth, North America had a bit more of a balanced economy, a lot less predatory in nature. There was, of course, still some colonial plunder happening, but not at the levels we saw elsewhere and would go on to see in many other colonies later. Building up a new nation to stand on its own legs through a sustainable economy is all great as a sociological project, but it doesn't get you cold, hard cash. And yes, many do believe that if something like the gold rush had happened while still under British rule, history could have turned out very differently. So how does a colonial overlord extract value from a balanced economy without easily accessible natural resources? There are multiple answers to this question, but one, the more idealistic answer, is that you simply form a trade union between the colony and the motherland, making it easy to trade with each other and putting tariffs or outright blocking trade from outside this trade union. All sounds good, but there's a problem with this, which we will get to. The other, much more direct and quick way to get something out of your overseas territories is to tax them directly. Now, we can really go into detail about the tax regimes, but it doesn't really lend itself to short cutaway sketch comedy. This is all heavily simplified, but in short, in the 1760s, Parliament imposed a number of taxes on the American colonies. The idea behind them was that Britain had just spent a huge amount of dosh to protect the colonies in the 7 Years' War. So a bit of balancing of the budget was considered fair. Most famous of these taxes was the infamous Stamp Act. Now, suffice to say, this didn't go down very well. This is where Britain often gets depicted as this colonial power ignoring the plight of the Americans and hell-bent on bleeding the colonies dry. Thing is, Parliament was sovereign in Britain. And the main point about Parliament is that there were differing opinions. Sure, there were those who didn't see an issue because people in England were already paying these taxes, but some MPs actually had quite a bit of sympathy for the Americans. We don't know exactly which ones. This is from the days before Hansard, and reporting on proceedings of Parliament back then was a crime. However, some like Isaac Barr MP publicly expressed their sympathy towards the Americans. Some even think that the Sons of Liberty got their name from his speech. And in the wake of the hostility which met the Stamp Act, the House as a whole cared enough to call a representative of the colonies to come before Parliament and answer MPs' questions about viable alternatives. This representative told Parliament that the colonies would not tolerate taxes. No taxation without representation. However, when pressed, he did leave the door open for duties on imports. So, that's what Parliament went for. In 1767, the Townshend, no, not him, even though this place and time is really up his alley, we're talking about this one, Townshend. Townshend Acts were a series of acts that scrapped the inland taxes but imposed duties at point of import on glass, lead, paint, paper, and most famously, tea. The colonies hated it. Turns out that despite what the representative said to Parliament, the colonies considered duties, or tariffs, just a consumer tax that was collected at a different point. So, looks like the representative misjudged the mood of the 13 colonies. His name, by the way, you might have heard of him, Benjamin Franklin. Rings a bell? The duties on paint, glass and lead were very unpopular because these were products for which America was reliant on Britain, and they were crucial to a lot of people. Tea, however, was a luxury, so why the anger? Well, a lot of tea merchants complained that the Townshend Acts had handed the trade over to the smugglers. Remember how we said that there was a problem with just having a trade union between the colony and the homeland? The problem was these guys. The Dutch Republic had the naval and financial might to set up a strong colonial economy. But they didn't have the demographic surplus to maintain colonies. So they decided to bring the gift of free trade to their European neighbors. Now, the other European powers weren't too keen on this. They wanted to keep their colonies exclusive to them. However, when it came to the Dutch, the expansion of free trade and open commerce, it wasn't a request. Like it or not, you were getting free commerce. The Republic, along with plenty of Danes and Germans, also referred to as Dutch, ran smuggling operations. It was a huge economy, to such an extent that some estimate that the vast majority of tea consumed in the northern colonies, which were the most populated ones, was provided by the Dutch trade, as it was referred to. In fairness to the Dutch, they practiced what they preached. They had no trade barriers themselves. That was one of the ways Dutch tea traders could make a killing on tea. Before the Tea Act, for tea to legally get from a Chinese mountain to an American cup, it first had to go from China to London, and the East India Company had a de facto monopoly on this. Then it had to be sold in London on the London Tea Auction to other tea merchants. A famous example of these tea merchants was the Twining family. These merchants would then be allowed to ship the tea to the American colonies where, under the Townshend Acts, there would be a duty payable at point of arrival, even if you were a British ship. So, a very clunky and quite expensive journey. Meanwhile, if you were a Dutch trader, you relied on your East India Company, the VOC, to get you a shipment of tea. It was imported into the Netherlands completely free of any taxes or duties. From there, any adventurous merchant could just try and get the tea into any market that did have duties and pocket the difference. Yes, they didn't just smuggle this into the Americas. The Dutch even smuggled tea into Britain itself circumventing the London tea auction. To get it into the Americas, they simply exported it to a Dutch holding in the Caribbean. That was the official destination. If any other merchant from there were to buy it and try to get it into another European country's colonial holdings, that's just free commerce. One estimate we found for the size of the illegal Dutch tea trade was around £400,000 in the 1700s. For reference, that was more, almost 10 times more than what the Townshend Acts were supposed to bring in. So when they insisted on putting duties on the colonies, the thinking might have been, well, we need to get something out of these colonies or else we are just keeping them safe for the Dutch to get rich off. So they put a duty on a few goods that they knew the Americans had to get from Britain. And, on top of that, the most smuggled consumer good: tea. Tea was so popular with smugglers because A, it was a luxury product, so the margins were good. B, it was exclusive. Very few countries had the means to get from China all the way to America, so there was little risk of being undercut by other smugglers. And lastly, it just smuggled really easily. You can sneak tea into small nooks and crannies, it hardly weighs anything, and it doesn't go off provided it's kept dry. Getting it through customs was pretty easy too. You could just fail to declare it, or, most commonly, bribe an official. You could even use the merchandise itself to do that. Once the product was in, you were safe. Tea itself wasn't illegal, and although British tea had a reputation for being better, it would need a real expert to tell them apart. The largest smuggling port was New York, partly because loads of companies there were still Dutch. This explains why one of the Townshend Acts was pretty much called the you New York Act. However, New York, Philadelphia and Boston said you right back. The colonies engaged in what was called non-importation agreements. Essentially, the merchants of New York, Philadelphia and Boston agreed to, as long as these duties were in place, not import any British goods. Some prominent people who would go on to become founding fathers, like Samuel Adams, would simply preach abstinence from things like tea. However, most people simply turned to the smugglers. The acceptance of non-importation wasn't watertight. The Sons of Liberty would enforce these boycotts, sometimes violently, but this meant that they weren't universally loved. A lot of people who weren't too keen on non-importation would accuse the Sons of Liberty and other people preaching non-importation of being hypocrites. For example, John Hancock, a man not known for his subtlety, was a proud supporter of the Sons of Liberty. But in 1769, accounts were published showing that he was importing plenty from Britain. This was a proper scandal at the time. Years later, John Adams was challenged on this, and he simply blamed Hancock's English business partner. Although non-importation was big in the northern cities, the southern colonies were actually pretty happy to buy legit tea, as they were apparently more willing to pay a bit more for better tea. We looked into whether this is the source of southern sweet tea. I wish it was true and this was the reason for that tea, but I couldn't find a strong enough link. So, ubiquitous adoption or not, in the period that the Townshend Acts were in full force, the situation in the Northern American cities was volatile to say the least. This period famously culminated in horrible episodes like the Boston Massacre. So it's not surprising that in 1770 the Townshend Acts were largely repealed and all duties were lifted. But one: tea. We have educated guesses but don't know for sure why the duty on tea was kept. Again, Hansard wasn't a thing yet. Thomas Curzon Hansard would only be born in 1776. One theory is that they kept the duty on tea to mainly not lose face in front of other European colonial powers. The most popular theory, however, is that it was to avoid acquiescing that Parliament didn't have the power to levy these taxes. We don't really know for sure. The years between quasi-repeal of the Townshend Acts and the introduction of the Tea Acts, yes, we're almost there, were historically known as the Quiet Period. The Sons of Liberty kept boycotting tea, that is, non-smuggled tea, but everything else was imported just fine. That's not to say that the clamour for independence was dying. That's an entirely different conversation outside of this video's scope. Tea smuggling was still big business. One story from this era goes that a small ship was caught on the Delaware with illegal tea, but the customs officers were overpowered, tied up and locked up below the decks of their own schooner. When they got out, the smuggling vessel was gone. When questioned about the incident, they mentioned that the masked men who violently overpowered them were all wearing pristine white stockings, implying that these were the local gentry and merchants, not rough hoodlums. At this point, 90% of the tea coming through New York and Philadelphia was Dutch. Boston, though, had a much larger legal tea trade, to the massive chagrin of the two other cities. I'm pretty sure there's a joke that Americans can make here, like, ha, typical Boston. But I've got nothing, so leave one down below. One of the main reasons for Boston being the goody two-shoes here is that they were a big transit port for tea being distributed to other colonies after an Atlantic crossing, which will become important. So apart from some kerfuffles, all went relatively well. That is until 1773, when the East India Company needed some cash. This was big. The closest comparison I can think of is the 2008 banking crisis. The company was, like banks in 2008, too big to fail. So the government under Lord North, who would go on to secure the still no sponsorship deal. Well, okay then. If you've enjoyed this video thus far, would you be so kind as to leave a like? It really helps us. Cheers. Where were we? Oh yes, the East India Company. The wealth invested in the East India Company was huge, and its insolvency risked bankrupting Britain itself. Enter the Tea Act. Under the Act, the East India Company would no longer be forced to drop their tea off in London and sell it to other merchants. They would be allowed to take their tea straight from China to America. No, legally speaking. In reality, they would usually stop over in Britain, for supplies and biscuits and all these things. The direct import would make tea, legal tea, significantly cheaper. Yes, the hated Tea Act actually made tea cheaper. Makes sense, as a lot of the middlemen were cut out. So, why were people so angry? Here is where the debate, back then and now, splits into two distinct sides. One side says that the Boston Tea Party was a revolt against an imperial overlord using its colonies as a piggy bank. The other side claimed that the Boston Tea Party was mainly a publicity stunt by rich smugglers. You probably already know how the first version goes about the righteous protest, so let's have a look at the latter version. Although I should point out here that we are not excusing colonialism. What we are looking to establish is that in this specific episode of American Revolutionary History, there's more going on than what is usually discussed. When the colonies were notified that tea would be arriving in their major ports cheaper than smuggled tea under this new act, they were confident that in Philadelphia, New York, the tea would not be landing or would at least be confiscated. Smugglers had 90% of the trade under control in these cities, so their influence was strong enough. Remember, these were rich and powerful people with white stockings. In Boston, however, which had been more legal tea friendly, there was a bit more doubt. Boston had form when it came to letting in British tea, and this is where the bulk of the new ships were headed. So, some have theorized that rich smugglers, fearing they would be undercut, staged a big protest under the guise of nationalist fervor to prevent the tea ever making landfall. They used their connections within the Sons of Liberty and got the group to go aboard the ships and chuck it overboard. Problem solved. Another, more charitable explanation, which sits somewhere in the middle, is that tea merchants, both legit and, well, less legit, didn't take kindly to the East India Company ignoring all their trade connections and just working with a bunch of hand-picked sellers, most of them of the loyalist persuasion. So, on the morning of 16 December 1773, the Sons of Liberty, a political protest group, or the agitators paid by the tea merchants, depending who you ask, went aboard the Dartmouth, Eleanor and Beaver and chucked 340 crates of tea overboard. Although eyewitness accounts do state that a lot of it also disappeared into some pockets. Something else we found interesting is that the Boston Tea Party is often talked about as this one-day event, but it's actually a sequel. We do know that a fourth ship was headed to Boston, though William had run aground and had to make port in Cape Cod, and so never made it to Boston at the same time as the other three ships. However, months later, in March of 1774, the Sons of Liberty found out that some of the tea from the William had been sold and was being kept in a Boston warehouse. So they went and destroyed that tea too. So what was their real motivation? Money or political ideology? Probably a bit of everything. It's safe to say that the news of the destruction of tea was a bit of a shocker here in Britain. Remember that Brits also pay tax on their tea, and the majority of them didn't get votes either. To our modern eyes, the Boston Tea Party looks like a form of non-violent resistance. The ships weren't burned, the crew was left unharmed. Was it that bad? Bloody right it was! Tea was an extremely valuable product, mainly consumed by the elites. You don't get consumable products in that sort of price brackets these days. At least not legal ones. You have to remember, this was supposed to be the cash cow of a company that made up a huge chunk of Britain's GDP. So, Britain reacted like a wounded animal, or an angry drug cartel, however you want to frame it, with violence and repression. Many argue, and we agree, that it's this repression that ended up sparking the American Revolution. Was it greed by smuggler barons gone awry? Or a colonial power overexerting its grip on a budding nation that was slowly drifting away? Even at the time, this was unclear and hotly debated. What I think should be emphasized is that even though the motives of some people who stayed conveniently on the docks when the tea was being thrown in the harbour are questionable, the people who actually went out there and did the steeping were most likely genuine and in it out of patriotism and idealism, not financial gain. But anyway, that's enough politics. Let's make some tea to go with our apple pie from the last video. We have the exact types and quantities of tea on board the Eleanor, Beaver and Dartmouth because the East India Company invoiced Parliament for the damages. Most were bohea, the most popular tea at the time and akin to a type of oolong. Singlo, likely Songlo mountain tea, Robert Fortune would pay that area a visit a few decades later. Hison, a green tea which doesn't appear to be around anymore. Kongu, a popular black tea, and Souchong, a strong black tea with its own story which we will keep for a different time. The most popular one was the bohea tea, so we're going to make an approximation of that. We have some oolong tea from the Wuyi Mountains and we'll be using this as it is, according to our in-house tea expert, a good and readily available proxy for the bohea tea that flavoured the Boston Harbour on that December morning. Do note, in recent years there has been this pesky myth doing the rounds that the tea chucked overboard was not loose but compressed in bricks. I don't know who started this story, but know this, tea was not normally done in these compressed cakes or bricks at the time. Compressed tea goes back to ancient China. We don't know exactly how far, but we do know it kind of fell out of favour in the late 14th century when Emperor Hongwu banned it for tribute. The bricks stayed around, but they became a sort of niche product. The tea bricks you may be familiar with, usually pu'er, only started regaining popularity long after the Boston Tea Party. Even if we give the story the benefit of the doubt and assume that this niche product might have made its way to America, we know it didn't make up any significant portion of the disposed tea. It's clear from the art depictions that this was loose tea, and there are plenty of eyewitness accounts mentioning handfuls and bales of tea. Also, the most slapstick bit of evidence, we think, is that there are plenty of accounts describing how a lot of tea floated. So it had to be beaten with oars before it sank. They really didn't want anyone fishing it out of the water. Goes to show how pricey it was. Unless there was some freak weather going on, we are going to assume that the water on a December morning in 1773 was cold. If you drop a load of this in cold water, it will not float. It's going straight to the bottom. That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with tea bricks, by the way. It's quite easy to buy these nowadays. They're mainly done for strong black teas, like fermented pu'er tea. They weren't the tea at the Boston Tea Party, but they can be very nice. A bit strong for my taste, but I know that our resident tea expert is quite excited about these. And that's why we are using a loose leaf tea, which today would be referred to as oolong. We will be making 2 cups. 1 cup will be made in our trusty teapot with lovely filtered water. Drink neat for the original Chinese flavor profile. Add sugar and milk for a more Western experience. Lovely. And now we make the other cup. Apparently, the salinity of the Boston Harbor is just below ocean level, so we need about 30 grams of salt per liter of water. Don't boil it. Chill it. The water was cold. So we added some ice, and yes, the ice is salted. Now throw in some tea. Since the water is salted, there's a good chance the tea leaves will float, which means, you've guessed it, beat it down with an oar or a spoon. Now serve and add garnish. So now we finally have some tea to go with the apple pie from the last video. Oh, if you're wondering, why such a British drink for our American birthday party? Despite what you might have heard, at the time of the Boston Tea Party, tea wasn't universally seen as a quintessential British thing among people. That only came about after Parliament slashed the tax on tea about 11 years after the Boston Tea Party. Anyway, happy birthday, America. You've achieved some really amazing things in your, so far, relatively short time around. Today, we celebrate to 250 more bountiful years. May they be filled with tea or coffee and apple pie in all its shapes and sizes one can imagine. You are the land of opportunity, are you not? We hope you enjoyed our 250 Years of America Double Bill special. If you did, please consider subscribing or leaving a like. Thank you very much for watching.